We are discussing matters climate financing, and do you know 29.5 billion US dollars was committed to Africa in the year 2019-2020 in matters climate financing, of which 11.4 billion, that is 39%, was for adaptation investment only. And for this to try and crunch the numbers, we are joined by George NJARI, who is the ACCA head for East Africa, that is the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants. And when we hear these numbers, I remember during the Africa Climate Summit, we also having crunching numbers, big numbers, climate financing. In the simplest form, how can we understand climate financing?
Thank you very much, and that's a very good question. Climate financing is also known by another name as green financing. And when you talk about green financing or climate financing, we're talking about being able to align financial investments with environmental goals. And who is making these financial investments? It could be the public sector, the private sector, or not for profit. And what are these environmental goals? It could be either climate change, which all of us know about, promoting renewable energy, fostering environmentally responsible practices. So how do we channel investments? How do we align investments to these environmental goals? So it can be backed by policies, it can be backed by incentives, but it's about driving investments to projects, to businesses which support environmental goals.
And when we talk about ACCA, we know ACCA, it's all about accountants.
Yes.
How does accountants and climate change, where do they merge? Where do they marry?
In fact, they are married at the hip. Because when you talk about investment, at the very core of investments, at the very core of any organization, at the very core of any finance function, we always find a professional accountant. And what's the work of a professional accountant? Is actually that. It's about resources, it's about financing. And if we are to be able to prioritize and direct investment to environmentally friendly goals, then the accountant needs to be at the center of that. They need to be able to know how do they source, how do they report. Because there's also an element of reporting. You're saying that this project is environmentally friendly. How do we measure that it's environmental? How do we measure the impact of it? So financial accountants are the very core of actually green financing.
And what are the frameworks of climate financing? And you know very well, Kenya and a host of other African countries, we are still developing. We are not yet there.
Yes.
And you're talking about Kenya, which look at the northern part of Kenya. When it's flooding, it's flooding. When we come to the drought, we are the worst hit.
Yes. I think some of these are very simple. And allow me to give you a very simple example. Last year, we needed to source for some what you call notebooks as ACCA Kenya. And we needed to source notebooks, but at the same time remain environmentally friendly. And in our mind, we thought, okay, do we have to go outside Kenya? Do we have to go outside Africa to be able to find an organization that is producing this? And we were surprised to find an organization that was producing environmentally friendly notebooks in Kibera.
Right in the country?
Right in the country, Kibera, who actually use recycled materials. They dry their materials using sunshine, so no electricity, renewable energy, sunshine. And actually, in their materials, those notebooks, they actually embed seeds. So when you finish using the notebooks, you can actually plant the notebook. And you can actually... So when you talk about frameworks, and when you think about that, we're very far behind. Could be that, but there are things that we can do even as we move along to develop these frameworks. I think the first thing is to be conscious of the fact that we need to go there as a country. I think even within the private sector, if I take an example, quite a number of banks are already thinking about how do they direct their loans so that their loans prioritize green-friendly projects, the projects which perhaps are more environmentally friendly. So I think even as we develop all these frameworks, there are things that can be done within the private sector, within the non-profit sector, like the example I've given you. So yes, it's a long way to go, but I think if we develop that consciousness, we are aware that we've got an environmental disaster coming in place if we don't do anything, then we'll be able to move to that direction. So yes, we do need those frameworks. Those frameworks will provide incentives for finances to go to to environmentally friendly projects within the public sector, for those investments from the public sector to prioritize things that you're talking about. So I think, yes, we do need those ones, but we can move along. As we develop those frameworks, we can move along. Yes.
And back to the Kibera example,
yes.
And it's quite commendable if these things can be scaled up, right?
Correct.
And Kenya has made tremendous achievements when it comes to some of the mitigating factors. We are using over 80% of renewable energy. How do we attract more climate financing models?
Yeah, I think in asking that question, you've got to keep in mind that there are several challenges when it comes to green financing. First of all, because it's a new thing, there are certain technological risks. Okay, even if you're talking about things like solar panels, okay, we are not too sure about how that technology pans out. It's been there all along, but you're not sure how it pans out. So there are certain challenges, even if you're talking about scaling up. You're talking also about the returns on most of these green-friendly projects. The returns actually come over time. It's not something you get in 2 years. Talking about a return that will come in 10 years. So being able to get funding for this sometimes is a challenge. So even as you're talking about being able to scale up, I think we have to be aware. And if I go back to the example that I've just given you, I think because of the risk associated with some of these technologies, which actually are green friendly, maybe it's a question of thinking of it in terms of SMEs, in terms of small scale, like the example I've given you in Kibera, so that if it doesn't work out, the loss is not so big. So I think it's about the public sector, the government, the policies to be able to focus on those small SMEs when it comes to then green financing.
And being an accountant and at ACCA, how can finance, accounts, and all those professionals in the finance sector, like yourself, support governments? Because where there is money, there need to be accountability.
Correct.
And remember, we are talking about developing countries in Kenya, where corruption is something that we are still fighting.
I think for me, it's two things. Number one is within the professional accountancy, and I talk about professional accountancy, it's not necessarily ACCA, it's all other professional accountancy bodies. I think number one is developing clear guidelines and standards which define what constitutes a green project or a green investment. Okay, and number two, transparency in reporting. Being able to report and say, this is how we shall measure the impact. Now, the reason for this is because this is what then guides a professional accountant. A professional accountant is guided by certain standards. So if those standards are developed and the professional accountant follow those standards, then at the same time, they're reporting. We're able to report so that you're not just reporting to say that this organization made a profit of so much billions. You're also saying that this organization also had an impact on the environment, on climate change to this extent, so that we are actually saying, yes, in as much as you're getting the financial profits, you're also having an impact on the environment.
And I'm looking at COP28, and we had the Africa Climate Summit a couple of months back, and there are a number of millions that will be spoken about, and some will even go to where they are supposed to. COP28.
Okay.
And Africa, we are going with our demands. We had the Africa Climate Summit.
Okay.
What more should we be seeking? Because every time we are seeking for dollars, and we have to ensure that this money is well accounted for and equitably shared, though many countries are having different challenges. The South is not having the same challenges as the North. As an African continent, what is the one voice that we should be taking to the COP28 as we wrap up?
I can only answer that as an accountant from a professional accountancy point of view. Because I think the other experts who can speak about it from different areas. I think when you talk about millions of funds being devoted to this, and I go back to the same answer that I said before, do we have clear guidelines, clear standards that will define what a green investment, what a green project is? So that, for instance, if organizations, be they in the public sector, be they in the private sector, are being guided by these standards. For example, within the public sector, accounting is guided by something called IPSAS. So how can we ensure that green financing is integrated there. Guidelines for green financing are integrated there. So that even if it's spending within the public sector, then it's within those standards that say, okay, let's prioritize the areas that contribute to the goals that I talked about, whether it's climate change, whether it is promoting renewable energy, etc. And the same thing also when it comes to the private sector. Same thing it comes, for example, to organizations that fund, whether it's getting green funds, green bonds, whether it's getting green loans. How can you make sure all these are actually prioritized to those projects, those businesses that are aligned to environmental goals? And then secondly, reporting. Okay, how do you ensure you've got an integrated reporting that not only captures the financial profit, but also captures the environmental impact?
I know our time is up, but you have a conference that you also have in December. In 20 seconds.
We do have what we call a conference. We normally call it the annual members convention. This is the fourth one we're having, and it will be in South Africa between the 6th and the 8th of December. And the theme of the conference is empowering finance professionals for sustainable development in Africa. And the whole idea is, what does sustainable development, and sustainable development is a bigger subset of green financing. What does green financing mean for professional accountants? Because we have to continuously empower and reskill accountants to be able to do the things that I've talked about.
Thank you so much, George NJARI, who is the ACCA head for East Africa, talking about climate financing. ACCA are the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants of Kenya.